Overs of mar féking uile agus fáilte chuid oribh gan nastra de hemmenar an ramsa hí seo ag somarostig agus ha mí overs of toligte chum a bhíagam táisiche le órad h-òrain ó Rona Wilkie mar ha fisig cuid agah ha Rona stúre cursicin 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 éige hananta chuúlaigh anéisiú cursicin fólam oscailte an an ollthaigh teagas na Gaeilge agus cuideach na bhíle cluiche agus éomhóireachta an ceòl agus h-òrain Gaeilge agus ha sin seach an nóbad ramsaí héice farbhilí gobad PhD ag ollthaigh a coid h-òrain as an airsinneoch agus na rainiad mar fáiste de behan an Gael as a naimhlín díag agus sé mar fáiste op a sin a bhís bríonrain an dú so natáisi sin Rona de bhí le bhí clúintin mun seo daoine eile tíanasteach seo so táisi sin Rona le bhí clúintin buaidh a chuspa a had an dú sin h-òrain mar gin abertabachas h-òrain mar
Muoike h-òrain han céine go na chuirte méteach Chiad míle tang abi ha mi uamsach cén toligte bhí an seo. Agus is bránach na gael mi am an somarasta céin cha bin gain sin a chud dói an tuile seo ach min dáchas gun tír mi uirigin gan ládach agus sibule aichgin. Dúir go chud an taisbenig seo nuas. Okay.
Coping mechanism. Shin and
coping mechanism, share. Yeah, but you're actually coping. Okay. So, Morantang is on the V call them and you am a few the should be a brain the boy of it click a cue it's certain Gaeilge gans na bliadhnaichean is Jane the Goirte Mòire. Ceòmhearsnach fa acam di bearna horst falla van roundsach acam skas melange agus sé seo chiad choimhearsnachdan a bhí acam chiilehiike fa gan hí bliadhnaichean agus me sin han chickal an big an goharid bhí brain hí bíon cultach di seo bíon halán sa eolaithe le a chusper seo. Bhín fatar nar coming an bíag se cain of go a mi cínteach gan bí agus feidirnach goharid me ha fioin gin na beachan acam háast féach go be an letií. Ha mi létálig gin choimeáin an roundsach a healtain riomh tapla abi son a chuideigh. Ha mi lándáchas can be chom ach an taring ar an eòlas aige as Jane na háid gus mu smáintin a nearsteach Bhín léighealigte céistin thos sa Gaeilge neos a bhéirle nó fiús an postjalain ha mo cheolach préistí ar an scrín. Leis can be mi a scríbig sa bhéirle agus am dóchas an capital seo éiseach sé béirle an canan a bhís acam inise seach na h-òrain na sa Gaeilge. Okay, bé mi menachin aharachach go béirle. Brain has changed to English. Cléva. So my research considers how Gaelic society managed to move from such a difficult period in the 1840s to building a strong pan-Scottish identity, which was highly organised and politically organised politically and culturally by the end of the 1880s. This was a multifaceted process, which I've split into three areas. Firstly, how continued music making helped Gaelic society deal with multiple experiences of trauma. Secondly, how musicking and song making helped build new networks and a pan-Scottish or even global Gaelic identity. And finally, how song making and performance of these songs helped created a heightened political debate which enabled Gaels to push for political change. Today I will concentrate on the first of these areas. Today is a day to concentrate on the woe. Specifically, I'm going to consider how music making and how the musical culture of Gaelic Scotland helped people overcome the trauma of famine and migration. The structure of the presentation will be as follows. Firstly, I will contextualise the mid to late 19th century using Gaelic song as a vehicle to tap into the emotional impact of the turbulence of this period. And then secondly, I will consider the role of the performance of these sources in helping society to cope in such a difficult time. On a macro level, this was an extremely turbulent period. This was a time of the Industrial Revolution where central Scotland became one of the most advanced industrial zones in the world. It was the age of empire. India officially came under the jurisdiction of the British Crown in 1858. There were opium wars in the Far East, and the scramble for Africa was well underway. Immigration to the colonies was constant, with Scots regularly ranking among the top three nations of immigrants from Europe throughout the second half of the century. And Gaels were present in each of these momentous arenas. Gaelic-speaking communities were established throughout the New World, many of which, of course, still maintain relationships with Scotland today. The myth of the Highland warrior was largely crystallised during the height of empire, and in the cities, Gaels joined the cheap labour force driving the Industrial Revolution. Gaelic Scotland was comprised of a linguistic and cultural group who held various positions in society and were born in both rural and urban Scotland. They belonged to different churches, or especially in the early part of the period, were often non-practising and held various local, linguistics, racial and national identities simultaneously. And many benefited from the expanding empire, with the recent important work by David Alston highlighting the impact of Highland-owned slave plantations in the Caribbean on the region, which continued to have a financial benefit throughout the 19th century. Moreover, the very colonies which were established in the New World were established on land dispossessed from indigenous peoples, a trend which Gaelic speakers were highly engaged in preventing at home in the Highlands and Islands. Therefore, we cannot and should not embrace the narrative of a wholly subjugated people, fully at the mercy of landlords hell-bent on clearing a land of a society. This is a complex group with a variety of perspectives, needs and motivations, some of which we would applaud today, and others which we would hopefully find abhorrent. Let's consider the context on a more local level. I will start with the famine. The first half of the 19th century was economically turbulent for Highland Scotland, with the region experiencing repeated economic depressions in the years following the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. The winter of 1846-7 represented a low point in the economic fortunes of the region. While the Highland famine was not on the same scale as its counterpart in Ireland, its impact was still vast. It was the culmination of several years of poor harvests and failure in the potato crop, which saw the entire failure of the potato crop in over 3/4 of crofting districts. I'm just getting my hot water bottle if you're wondering what I'm doing. As we can see from some of the news reports here, hopefully you'll be able to see them. Yep. The reality of the poverty was quite shocking. By mid-1846, an Inverness Courier correspondent was heartened that 1/5 of the potato crop had been saved in Strome Ferry. Heartened at 1/5 of the potato crop being saved. And this, he contrasted the situation to nearby Fernick, where people lived in cottages or huts, which were miserable in the extreme, to quote him. Another Inverness Courier correspondent 1 week later told of hunger so weakening that one man could hardly lift an oar. We must rely heavily on sources such as the state papers and news reports when trying to study the famine, as there are very few songs which I can find which discuss the period in detail. I only know of one, Baba Moliana, which I will come to later. If you know of more, I would like to know what they are, so please tell me. The lack of songs looking at this period might be surprising to us, especially as we're given to thinking of Gaelic song as a corpus obsessed with the sadder side of life. Indeed, this is particularly the view given to 19th century poetry, which, as Sorley MacLean put it, was depressing and even hopeless in tone. Just as a quick aside, I am going to quote Sorley MacLean quite a lot in this talk, mainly because I think his opinions of 19th century Gaelic song are indicative of much of the 20th century scholarship on the corpus, but also because I think his descriptions are very, very funny. Rest be assured, I love Sorley MacLean, I love his work, but I think he was a writer first and foremost, and as such he didn't give his predecessors as much credit as they were due. So if this obsession with woe is to be believed, why are there so few songs about famine? Why aren't there songs about hunger if there were songs about lost love, lost land, lost boats, lost battles, lost babies, and even rape and incest? However, Gaelic Scotland's lack of songs dealing with the famine is not conspicuous in a global context. There's a deafening silence in folklore archives across the world when it comes to famine and other natural disasters. Indeed, Irish historians have spent considerable time untangling the folklore memory of the famine from the later consolidation of a collective memory of trauma, often imposed by nationalists. Cormac O'Grada's excellent, incredible study of the 1930s collections of the Irish Folklore Commission showed that while some pieces reflected personally on the suffering of the famine, this was unusual. He commented that some specific features of famine suffering, which might be expected to leave their mark on the oral traditions, such as personal reminiscences of the workhouse or employment on the public works, are reflected only faintly or at a safe distance in the folklore archives. His explanation for such a silence was varied, and he suggested that shame could have suppressed a collection of personalised memories. He also drew on psychiatric research, which has revealed that survivors of disasters, to quote, often show considerable memory impairment. Whilst these reasons are plausible to me to an extent, I do not think that they explain why there should be so few examples of personal suffering reflected in the song corpus, especially as, in the Highland context, crofters did not shy away from discussing the hardship of the famine in front of the Napier Commission in the 1880s. And we can see some of their accounts here. There must be, therefore, a further explanation for the dearth of autobiographical evidence in the folklore collected about famine. I am most convinced by O'Grada's suggestion that this was due to the divisive nature of famine. Famine, according to O'Grada, destroys community cohesion and this process is difficult to verbalise afterwards and almost impossible to memorialise. He argued that, to quote, a disaster that struck the poor more than the rich and that pitted neighbour against neighbour is hardly promising material for a communal collective memory. And such divisions can be seen in the contemporary reportage from this period in Scotland. For instance, we can see the rise in tensions in February of 1847, when the Inverness Courier reported that there was rioting in Buaidh over an outward shipment of grain. There's also evidence of crime rising, with a Sutherland Estate Factor report written during the economic depression in the late 1860s, stating, "I do not believe there was ever more scarcity of food or more actual pinching and suffering." Folk memory, particularly performed folklore such as song, often depends on the acceptance of both the performer and the audience. A performance of songs pertaining to the famine could not be guaranteed to have a harmonious reception. Therefore, they are likely to have been less performed and as such less likely to survive into the 20th century collectors' collections archives. Lilith O'Leary and Sean Williams' study on Joe Heaney's performance of famine repertoire highlights the divisive nature of famine songs in Connemara in County Galway right into the late 20th century, when they conclude that Heaney chose to avoid the controversial local song that Heaney, to quote, chose to avoid a controversial local song that gives a less than flattering portrayal of relationships within his own community. Therefore, drawing on this research from Ireland, we can draw inferences about the state of Gaelic society in the Highlands due to the lack of surviving song from the period. It appears as though this was a society which was not only hungry, but one which was in deep distress, given that their community bonds were increasingly under pressure. There's also, of course, the physical manifestation of community disintegration and the necessary accompaniment to famine, and that of migration. People who used to live in a place no longer live in that place and become the residents of somewhere new, somewhere they didn't live before, and somewhere where they do not belong to a community. And as we can see from the Glasgow Herald's report of the Oceanic Society's annual supper in March 1852, the migration that followed the failures of the potato crop were a major concern. To quote, Mr. McFadden, in proposing the future prosperity of the Highlands, said that the condition of Highlanders during the last 20 years was truly deplorable, but that the Highlanders were becoming alive to their condition and are endeavouring to better their circumstances by emigrating, but still the Celtic exodus has something of a sadness connected to it. No patriot, he went on to say, would wish to see the Celtic exodus completed. Emigration has long been associated with this period. Assisted emigration schemes intensified after the famine, with at least 16,500 emigrating with financial assistance, and still more, many, many more, that we do not have the numbers for independently. Temporary migration had become a common financial fix for the poorest families by 1847, and this too intensified, with between 1/2 and 2/3 of people in Skye dependent on work in the lowlands as their means of living. This was in concert with already high levels of one-step migration to the lowlands. The impact of migration or of emigration is twofold. In the first place, there was the impact on the migrants, and secondly, there was impact on those who remained in place. Let's consider first those migrating. Scholars of migration have come to understand that the personal consequences for migrants were and are often devastating. Poverty, loneliness, depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia are all present in migrant communities at a higher level than the general population, especially when the migration has been made out of need rather than commenced voluntarily. Marjorie Harper of the UHI's recent work on Scots and Scandinavian-born patients in Vancouver mental asylums from 1870 to 1914 demonstrated the extent to which many migrants found themselves in poor mental health due to stress, loneliness, and a lack of support network. She showed that 67% of inpatients in British Columbia were foreign-born, despite immigrants only making up 42% of the population. This distress is reflected in the songs. Perhaps the most famous example of mental exhaustion came from Canada in the form of a-mach, composed in Nova Scotia in the early 19th century. I could sing this for you, or we could get Arster Cormac to sing it, and I chose Arster Cormac. So let's just get that up here, maybe. Here we are. I'll put the words up as well.
Chajian mi oren a chuir da iawn, nuair ni mi tá seach bi mi traum. Chael mi gaelig seach mar a bavish go, nuair a va mi san dwy chael. Hanai mi min sin illuman an artu getvam Gàidhealach h-òrain. Sheviat ich bron gos a lut ich solas gyntunye calrum an idum kainj. Gach was eichus gach cadanimi Gymbi mi cainach a gawns gach aum. En sier a gach ni van teich gentale Get ham in dras down en braie glau.
I know it's been said many a time, but what a voice. Hopefully this will come up. Here we go. So we know that this song was sung in Scotland during the mid to late 19th century and was likely popular, given that it appeared in the premier collection of Gaelic song of the period in h-Òrain. We can also find similar songs composed by Gaels living in the lowlands. Dálmach Gunnegan was highly aware in around 1860 that the foreignness of Glasgow could drive him to mental instability. I don't have the tune for this, but I'll read it for us. Chachlau mi Gaelic, chotik min canan, fai mi acal, fas mi Gàidhealach. And it was not just the language barrier which was commented on in this corpus, but also the environmental change. In his famous song, Hí Míle Mór Bhealna, composed in 1856, Ian Cameron longed for the quiet of Morven instead of the clatter of the heavily industrialised city. Wait till I find the tune. Back me uprich surcha serlakari, like in a cheer and cluiche hakari. Back me kurchen tunche salo, a gower ket glamour numbo. Let's secondly consider the impact of migration on those who remained in place. Now, whereas the songs such as those composed in urban spaces often discuss the new sounds and the din of the city, it is the silence of empty villages which are discussed in the rural corpus. In his epic Fis chun a Bhairt, William Livingston systematically compared the Isla of his childhood to the situation at the time of its composition in 1863. Among his observations was the quietness of Isla, in contrast with the bustle of his youth. So chachlunir lunyak oyen, sheistan oran lei, schanaike shoj mad bavish, a could bad it fachere, hook anerst falkri oanyet, slish the koi boy mazal, lish na hoer sachonek me, big fish show, ikavarsht. Mary Bowes, Sorry Lishan Nolagud, posits a similar sentiment as she narrates her return to Skye for the new year, comparing the celebrations of the 1880s to those of her childhood. I'll just play you a little of Cathy McPhee singing this.
Jak mi elan gulnen skia, wo jun kors da ich het blian, smare chucheliaten rian, skien elum agol galwai.
So in that, when the verse here, no, acharo mai chinnabenok, es niaven knakatian klo, tunis ma checken a horn, palabetot namna. This, similarly, in this anonymous song from the 1860s, the This highlights the personal impact of the depopulation as it accentuates the personal loss of family and the consequential loneliness and uncertainty about her family's success abroad. Hamin seo an tulaí ag bun a bhrúigh leom hain, smíhí smuinti mum chárstin, mar a ha mi nan jay, galav mahir smovahir, smovrad and galéir, get a cluiche mogada, central aiglas, and get nan jade, noad galav Venus nan gale, shoot an aramen vamor, vakir hiat, sagayu, an cardigs na comb. Nan ro service nam favid, gan tor savage anon. Ri nan dúl, vi gat charnig, har salje and tone. Very, very sad. So I hope that this discussion of the impact of the famine and migration goes some way to contextualising Gaelic Scotland. There are clearly other factors at play as well. Among these are the recent schism in 1843 of the Church, which was hugely impactful on the religious practice of much of Gaelic Scotland. And there were continuing evictions throughout the period, of course, as well. However, the contextualisation of the famine and the impact of migration goes some way to highlighting the extent to which this was a period of quick and major change, which resulted in widespread experiences of intolerable hardship and the feeling of discombobulation from separation, due to separation from their community of old. My question is now is how the substantial musical culture of Gaels in Scotland impacted the way in which they dealt with this new reality. I'm going to start by concentrating on the individual experience and then widen my scope to bring in community music making. A key concept in this analysis is that of musicking, which Christopher Small argued was as basic a form of social interaction as talking in his groundbreaking text, Music of the Common Tongue. This claim presumes that, to quote, everyone is born capable of musicking and is predicated on the stance that musicking does not only describe the performer's place in the music-making process, but rather defines music-making as communal work in which both the performer and the audience are involved. Listeners then, as well as performers, are all actively musicaling. This built on John Blacking's argument that, to quote, listeners are as much as part of the process of music-making as composers and performers. All humans have the capacity to make sense of music. I will start then, not with active music making, but with reception of music. Perhaps one of the most moving pieces of literature for me on the reception of music is by David Huron, who wrote on why sad music is pleasurable. We all know the feeling. For me, there is nothing better than to listen to Radiohead when I am down in the dumps, and it's not as though Tom York's crooning is much for nopper, yet I still feel better. Huron built his work on the study by Jocelyn and Lauka, which found that sadness was the 8th most reported affective state induced by music. So he considered the type of sadness those reporting felt, and whether they felt real sadness, and if sad music could evoke pleasure. He concluded that exposure to sad music encourages more accurate self-appraisals and more realistic assessments of the likelihood of certain outcomes. That is to say then, that to engage in sad music is to distance oneself from the actual distressing matter and to come up with resolutions. These insights suggest that, quote, the naturally depressing and hopeless work of the 19th century as described by Sorley MacLean could in reality be a more proactive activity than just wallowing, which both made people feel better and helped them plan for a better future. Let's have a look at one of these songs, Gàidhealtachd by Bhiodh Gàidheil. Here it is. Now, it must be admitted that this song isn't the best defence to Sorley MacLean's cutting remarks about 19th century Gaelic poetry, which, over and above of all the other insults we've heard, he called flabby and anemic. It lacks power, gusto, spontaneity, and joie de vivre. My question would be, however, wasn't that the point? Obviously, wallowing in woe is cathartic. We have all experienced this. And my goodness, does she wallow here. her verses are sad, very, very sad. And then as a pick-me-up, she then adds a chorus which starts off with Good Mulothalchami, I am very sad. Now, we all know from the political impetus in her other work that she's very capable of trying to find solutions to problems and offering brosnachig or encouragement to her performers or listeners. I would suggest, therefore, that the vibe that Mary is going for is, as Sorla MacLean put it, anemic and lacking gusto. Rather than this being a flaw, it is the point. The first 3 verses of this song are vague and could pertain to most urban Gaels' experience of being separated from the homeland, wherever that may be during this period. Receivers of the song were able to empathise fully with the singer and join the chorus in a shared cry of woe. This in itself is cathartic. As Mary Gore becomes more specific in her song and the universal relevance reduces, the separation between the singer and audience widens. This is where the role of the empathetic listening discussed by h-Òrain is particularly useful when considering the impact of such a song on its audience. On the one hand, the audience member is actively engaged with the performance of the song, which likely narrated an experience of which they were highly familiar. On the other, there was necessarily a distance between the audience member and the song. Audience members were, after all, not the primary performer, and the song likely contained faintly unfamiliar details. Certainly, such a song would allow the audience members to experience a collective mourning as they recognised themselves in the narrative and as they sung their sadness together in the keen-like chorus. However, simultaneously, the distance of the audience member to the singer and the details of the narrative could allow for the creation of a sensation of safety, that this was not the reliving of an autobiographical trauma, enabling them to evaluate their trauma from a safe space and lay the foundations for progress. The vagueness of the imagery in Good Mulothalchami is essential in creating this dichotomy, and the lack of rhetorical specificity became increasingly popular throughout the period. I would agree with Meg Bateman's argument that this trend likely occurred as bars became aware that they no longer only had to cater for their immediate communities, but also for people across the country. New MacLeod's An Glans and Romiog, the Glen where I was young, is a perfect example of this. Which Glen? Well, you choose. The whole room, made up of Gaels from across the country, could collectively miss their Glen, sharing the loss of home, if not the loss of exactly the same home. However, the lack of specificity, it's a hard word to say, or perhaps the jarring details of the Glen in the song, which don't match your own Glen, allowed for distance to occur between the audience member's experience and the song's story, providing a safe space from which the traumatic events of forced migration, voluntary migration, or seasonal migration could be reviewed. And musicologists have long noted the extent to which migrant communities ensure that they stay in touch with the music of their homeland, arguing that this engagement was a key cornerstone in the diaspora's assertion of their identity. Indeed, Mark Slovan suggested that, to quote, music is central to the diasporic experience, linking homeland and hereland with an intricate network of sound. Thomas Turino went further, contending that controlling the sonic space was a way to assert the individual identity and sense of self. We know that Gaels were no different, and that they sought to create opportunities for these musical performances in the cities, with 20 Highland societies created in Glasgow alone during this period. And we can hear delight upon being surrounded by Gaelic music from their songs. This one by Niall MacNeil, composed for the annual of the Glasgow Isla Society, and it revels in the fact that he was surrounded by his people, by music and by Gaelic. It is less easy to find examples of palliative and restorative processes from our period, which other researchers have described. John Bailey's account of an elderly Afghan refugee being reunited with his traditional music shows the extent to which music could bring about some relief. and I am sure that you will agree with my suggestion that similar experiences were likely to have occurred in diasporic Gaelic communities. Here is his description. Singers Nagma and Mangal were over from Pakistan. Among the guests was the distinguished Afghan historian and journalist Gul Ahmad Karzai, a great music lover. After dinner, the musicians asked him to play for him, and they performed till 2 a.m. Karzai was so weak when he arrived that he had to be supported by 2 people. When he left, he was walking on his own 2 feet. Anyone familiar with the use of music therapy in palliative care in the West will find this a familiar example of the restorative power of music. Let's move from the reception of music to the individual music making. The opportunities for singing in Gaelic Scotland were numerous. In 1905, Eòlais from Eriskay commented that, to quote, "Whenever I am not saying my prayers, I'm singing. Ever since I was a child, I was not without a toromon of a song in my mouth." Indeed, the extent to which the singing tradition was ubiquitous in Gaelic communities even surprised collectors in the 1960s, amazed as they were by their sources' capabilities. John McInnes reported on one such occasion in 1967. Recently, a colleague and I had the somewhat startling experience of being addressed for the best part of 20 minutes in impromptu song by a man whose home we had both called at unexpectedly and for the first time. Such knowledge of the musical tradition highlights the degree to which singing and engaging in music was an ordinary aspect of the lived experience, at least in rural areas. To sing was normal, but that's not to say that it was unthinking. It has been long established by musicologists that the act of choosing how to fill a sonic space is based on a conscious decisions with musical choices. And this is key to our understanding on how it helps people cope. In her excellent study on 2 musicians dealing with trauma, Annette Swart argued that it was important to acknowledge that, quote, "music expresses emotions. It is not neutral, and human beings often associate pieces of music with people, memories, places, and events. And these pieces of music," she goes on to argue, "can have both a positive and negative influence on the healing process." I have no doubt that there were many pieces of music which didn't help Gail's cope. For instance, I have strong suspicions that the extensive singing of Jacobite songs re-traumatised subsequent generations. I am at a loss, however, on how I can evidence this. If anyone has any ideas, please tell me and share them with me. So my focus right now is on how to consider how music could help Gail's cope. And for our brief exploration into individual music making, I would like to consider lullabies. Lullabies are famous for their bleakness. Margaret McDowell suggested that, to quote, "the folk lullaby uninhibitedly expressed the complexity of a love that cannot be disassociated from tension, anxiety, and depression. Paradoxically, the songs which purport to soothe and cheer an irritable baby provide release for the mother." And recent medical research on the singing of lullabies in the months before and after birth concluded that, quote, "maternal singing was proved to have a positive effect on perceived maternal stress." This ties into the extensive work which has concluded that an interaction with music can reduce stress, depression, and anxiety. Now, whilst we can't be sure that the results of these modern studies would have been replicated in the 19th century, McDowell and other scholars' insight on why such dark topics emerge in this genre suggests that mothers were soothed by their singing, just as the modern scholars have observed in their studies. Yusuke Uno, for instance, in her comparison of Scottish and Japanese lullabies, identified that lullabies became one of the few opportunities for mothers to release their frustrations and to voice their depression. She added that we can consider lullabies to have a healing or cathartic effect. The performance context, that's of being a mother to a small child with disturbed sleep and with profound fears over the viability of the new child, must also be considered. McDowell argued that this creative environment has produced one of the most revealing corpuses for historians. She said, When a woman's fatigue and her child's sleeplessness erode her sense of propriety and her characteristic maintenance of personal privacy, folk lullabies express her thoughts. In these lyrics, which only ostensibly address the child, she articulates strong feelings intended for herself alone to hear. Perhaps this is why, as far as both myself and Mairead Challan can see, the only account of hunger we have from the Gaelic song corpus comes from a lullaby. The highly private nature of lullabying also would have allowed the song to be created and transmitted without concern of creating the public strife that O'Leary and Williams suspected kept Joe Heaney from singing famine songs in public. I will sing it here for us. I will sing this one here for us. Baba Mullyanna Big. I'll sing it now. Baba Mullyanna Big. Bhiodh Gàidheil Gàidhealach Big. Baba Mullyanna Big. Handurin mi Gàidhealach. Jiggle ni mi dùth. Chuimhearsnachdan agus. Galram gun gabú crúb. It is my profound hope, an expectation, given what we know about the healing properties of singing, that the original composer and the singers who took her song felt better for singing this. Interestingly, just to hark back to the research discussed previously regarding how engaging with sad music can help one contextualise their worries, we can hear her both express deep concern, but also imagine a better future and begin to question how to get there. I have no doubt that this was therapeutic. So let's move on to thinking about community music making. The academic literature on the performance arenas of Gaelic Scotland has long concentrated on the role of the ceòl house as a driving force for the oral tradition. Ceòl houses were the most common social space for rural Gaels until the First World War. And generally, ceòl houses were ordinary houses in each township which would host locals and visitors daily to sing, tell stories and discuss news. Thomas A. McKean argued that they were, quote, the context for social interaction. The role of the Tying Ceòl in transmitting rural Highland culture cannot be overemphasised. Father John MacDonald furthered this by describing the ceòl house as the basic social context within which all aspects of the oral tradition were celebrated and transmitted. They were also fun. I've listened to many accounts of gatherings in ceòl houses, and almost all of them emphasise how enjoyable they were. Let's listen to Alexander Murdy's song that he composed for his ceòl house, where he names people, talks about what they do, and says, "Huairsing kindness agus spórsam." We had kindness and fun there. Here we are.
Seohicken, horohicken, hiorogersin batoyal, Vaishin kele daivi kalan, huarchen kaida sagas porsan. Huarchen shenachesen bochavam, oran kulvo peki, yor ishatri ved motolalan, Posta pel odina nostario hitten, oro hitten, hioroger sin vatoyal, Vaishin kele daivi kalan, huarchen kaida sagas porsan.
For this recording, we can have no doubt that the ceòl house not only was a source of much entertainment, but also created an environment in which neighbourly bonds could thrive. In a society in which inter-community relations had been stretched beyond comprehension, the importance of this space in rebuilding Gaelic society cannot be underestimated. Mairead Challan's extensive research into the oral culture of North Uist has advanced her understanding of the multifaceted nature of ceilidhs. Firstly, she has identified that ceilidh houses were not just winter institutions as previously thought, but ran all year. She also addressed the absence of women from ceilidh houses, a feature of the institution often neglected by scholars. Whilst Hallan has emphasised that most women were not in attendance of ceilidhs in the evening due to this being their time of work, she brought the existence of the female ceilidh houses to light, which took place among women during the afternoons. Furthermore, Hallan has broadened the scope of what we understand as a ceilidh to include sporadic ceilidhs. These could take place wherever Gaels were gathered, and she included descriptions of ceilidhs in important meeting places in towns, such as shops, or when Gaels were not at home, such as in pubs and churches in the lowlands, fishing ports, and during leisure time in the army. Ceilidhs were everywhere, and their ability to enable Gaels to come together as a community is only beginning to be understood with this exciting research. Whilst having fun is obviously hugely beneficial in creating inter-community harmony, perhaps as important was the use of song and collective singing in this process. As we could hear from Alexander's song, Gaelic songs commonly had choruses, or at least refrain lines, in which people could join. Indeed, his chorus, which consists of vocables and is sung in the third person we, was clearly constructed so as to encourage people and those around him to join in. However, collective singing was not only reserved for ceilidhs. Work songs, for instance, almost always had a chorus, for the obvious reason that these refrains helped keep the team in time. New research on the physiological changes on singers observed by scientists in their study of the impact of social singing on social cohesion and the treatment of mental illness suggests that these shared refrains also helped singers feel more unified and closer to each other. Chemical changes in the saliva of those involved in community singing projects showed an increase of immunoglobulin A, associated with positive emotional arousal, and a reduction on cortisol, an indicator of stress. And although it is impossible to definitively project these findings of modern scientific research onto our period, it is reasonable to suppose that, as in the modern world, singing relieved stress. Perhaps this stress-relieving property can go some way to explain why the chorus became so popular in this period. Indeed, we know that Victorian Gaels were particularly partial to a chorus. 65% of the songs published in h-òrain, for instance, had a chorus. Oh, I've gone one too far. In the song Bhiodh Gàidhealach, created by a-mach as a contrast to his earlier song that we considered a we can see the uplifting properties of the chorus reflected in his choice of lyrics. Here, instead of being in solitude, he is surrounded by people and asking them all to sing. He is cheerful. Bíodh Gàidhealach tóg faun, ceòl, súntach, bhith traum, Gàidhealach sláinte na bhfuil hawl an tír nan beawns nan gleanmh. Be light and start a song, merry, cheerful, without being heavy, toasting those who are abroad in the land of the mountains and the glens. And let's not take his word for it, only his word for it. The Victorians often told us about how excellent the music and the singing was at their gatherings. Newspaper reports. I put a couple of them up here to look at, but I would like to mention the top right-hand corner. I do wonder how bad the choir must have been for it to be merely described as efficient. As you can see from these clippings, it was common for there to be a ball or an assembly at these gatherings in the lowlands, and at balls and assemblies, we dance. And we also know that moving as one was common in rural contexts too, whether that be in the aforementioned work environment or in the ceilidh house. I have long loved this description of a ceilidh house in Skye. Let's have a quick listen. It's actually from Slate, so a local.
Vi har en sin ceòl at all the roads, and that was a good job. Agus handilis de nalin in van door te gawkeri. Han aan mij gebristi gunja kan wij zijn niet.
Nee, dat ze pusht we gach maar pug.
Zij maar betrichtje zij.
Dus niet heen, we kunnen zo eens naar bord.
Wanneer pusht er in een van hun huur dan plion de reis aan me gaan. agus bhí bóla go mesan agus dagus agus bhainna caiideach an choméir a bhna chuir a gagus le bóla go mesan héin.
Is dé dansa chin bh gaita déana?
sé dagus a sléifpichin an pomú a déana sé.
Péidir díos?
Dagus a chláimh mar batríe.
Ó seo?
Dagus a chláimh. Agus bhí go ríomh se sin ó an riils a bhain Scotch riils stéis. Géidir mi dear an nó mar sa nóirstal tinine a chuine go mar ige do éis an nóir se bhar na bhagad.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we can hear him describe stick dancing, sword dancing, and Scotch reels, but he also, with a real fondness, praises the older women in the room for their movements to the music while sitting down, saying that they could almost have been dancing themselves. Emma Cohen argues that the mounting evidence from behavioural and psychological sciences now indicates a powerful causal association between synchronous group activity and social cohesion. Evidence has also emerged which suggests that, quote, when people perform the same movements at the same time, there is a co-activation of action and perception networks, which is believed to blur the sense of other and self. And this leads to an increase of trust and generosity between people inside the group. This builds on some of the literature we've already touched on, which argues that singing and making music together brings about greater social cohesion and helps form a shared identity. These social gatherings, it seems, were not only facilitated performers and audience members to safely confront their trauma, but they also induced physiological and psychological changes in individuals which would help them create the strong social bonds so necessary if they were to successfully rebuild their communities. So to conclude, I would argue that it was only with this renewed social cohesion and shared sense of self brought about by musicking that Gaelic Scotland could begin to form the social and political movements which could challenge the further encroachments on their land rights and which could attempt to protect the Gaelic culture and language. This is the next step of Gaelic Scotland in this period, where music could be used as a mechanism for thriving and not just surviving. But that is research for another day. Ciat míle daing,
Thank Bhiodh Rona san órach h-òrain chosmúnicha agus really h-òrain faking na snálan chin call of gifeth raointean-eòlais. Really interesting to see the perspectives that your music theory brings to an understanding of the kinds of events and organisations that we're used to thinking about. Really fascinating. So thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be questions and comments. Elena, I can't see everybody online. So if we'd like to ask a question or make a point, if you could use the little button at the bottom where there's a heart which says react, and if you click on the arrow there's a thing which will let you wave a hand. I might not see you if you're waving your actual hand, but do feel free to join in. Put me fine in Santosha.
Is Christine Primrose Shaw Simone. I Rona. Kian Tying, I ain't not Gàidhealach, agus go mí os tá féime se fallaba bhuaidh am an minach agus féime mi fallaba mór an cain agus ma hin mi tasing I dair an sami the h-Alba like mi fís.
Míle daing. Áron na Goirte se sin na Hamilorach. So míle daing.
Okay, so dynnig fall of some cunning in your classic Himig vel Kestig to William.
Hello, Rona. Hello. Sorry, Jamal. That was really good. Thank you so much. I was just going outside and I was getting. Do you know the book The End of Outrage?
What
do you think about it?
It's on the reading list, I'm afraid.
Right.
I haven't got there yet, but I picked it up a couple of years ago, and due to various reasons, I've not been engaging with this. But would you recommend it as a good place?
I would, because I don't think that anybody could write that sort of book, but somebody who's connected with a particular township, and he's writing about the tensions, which are really tearing apart this community after the famine. and to do with culture shift and to do with the changing in perspective, and how that meant that individual families were basically fighting it out among themselves. It's a very, very difficult book to write and to read, but it's very much what I think we'd call the sort of the interior history of a township, rather than the sort of history that you tell to people from the outside, which is very, very different, obviously. I remember another singer actually writing a really good article about the history of the solace clearances, and how it was the same there. You had in the 1850s, early 1850s, you had people falling out with each other because of what to do. The question about that. Oh, yeah. So that's my.
Yeah, I think that the historiography around this period is often based in economic studies, and therefore, and also necessarily for a lot of historians who don't speak Gaelic, is based in estate papers. And it's not to say that these aren't hugely valuable studies; they are hugely valuable. But I do feel that we have to look at the moment to Ireland and see how they are dealing with this internal strife in order to begin to understand. And it's not something that I'm going to be able to deal with completely in this paper that I'm producing. But I think at least at this stage, I feel that it is reasonable to acknowledge that this is a society which is being torn apart, and that is dealing with personal trauma, but at the same time is dealing with the physical and psychological loss of neighbourliness, and what that means, and how do they step on from there. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. Really, really interesting.
Míle daing.
Hi, Bhuaidh. Kirsten B. Bhuaidh, Guinness B. Ella.
Well, and your ceòsteach a-mach gavan seo, ma mi h-òrachaidh because na jigs mani that h-òrain Goirte, Jimmy go mas slant in a fediv. I could have gauge mar na Rona banat a fast. It's what the fall of Canada.
Ba meets me who get an h-òrain sin chuideachadh.
Okay.
And yemi and it kainakam and draste Gina ha alna with me sule the issue that more than time.
Okay, yeah. Cheers.
Did me hinchilstrach like Keshman movie Shane Kohler, and the sort of physiological and bonding aspects of doing things together. I always had this fantasy, if I was ever in charge of the department, would I make everybody come and sing in assembly in the morning, because it's that sense of bringing everybody together and doing something, and you think gosh, you'd have such a hard time implementing something like that now as an intentional, we want everybody to come together, but actually you can see, it's the kind of thing we had at school, you can see the benefits of it even when people are grumbling and fussing about it. And I just wondered if you'd come across much about the intentionality in those urban settings of creating the occasions where people would come together, because you see a lot of discussion of how important it is for I suppose the social aspects and the welfare aspects of bringing people together, and how important those different Highland and Island associations were for people. But does that ever stretch into bits where they're actually talking about the emotional impact or the kinds of things that you've been drawing out there in terms of rebuilding sociability and neighbourliness and those kinds of experiences?
Not that I've found other than expressions of that within song, the delight of coming together and singing with some of the examples that I've given you there. I think that the societies is one of the examples. I think there are also Priscilla Scott, who I think is on the call, has looked at the reconstruction of walkings in the lowlands, and Buaidh na Femin is an example of that. A walking song that was created by Maddie Bhiodh. That's a really interesting aspect. I think, why on earth would women want to be involved with such dirty and arduous work unless they were getting a benefit from it? And my suggestion, and I've published on this, would be that the benefit from that is a feeling of catharsis, and having access to a therapeutic space without men in it. And I think the other area is in church. There's a huge concern in the 1850s by the lack of attendance in Gaelic churches. If you look through 19th century newspapers, they're just filled with stress and about there not being enough money for the Gaelic chapel or creating a new church. And they had put on all sorts of ways to try and get people into church, such as providing them with appropriate clothing and making sure that there weren't going to be any fees for them to pay for the rent of a pew. Whilst clearly this is an evangelical, there is an evangelical aspect to this, I do wonder as well as if there's also a recognition that church is beneficial because you come to sing together. And I think, in there's kind of two modern examples I can think of where people are singing in a religious context, or semi-religious. One is in public schools, where the whole public school gets together and sings. This is because you have a bunch of teenagers living on the same place. You have to find some way for them to build social cohesion every day. The other place is in Japanese workplaces, where they sing together in the morning, and in a way that we would think is slightly funny, but it makes total sense that you're bringing everybody together and having them sing together in order to do that. So if you ever become the head of Somarostic, please make everybody sing together in assembly. I think it would be great.
That's quite enough of my assembly fantasies, but yeah. Paul, you had a thought.
It's making me think of things. There's been a couple of studies about singing in the military still today. How it's used, obviously, the Russian army choirs, the French choirs, etc. It's singing in the military is quite old because it builds your chest, which is good in a shield war, but also it builds cohesion between the men within the battalion. And that's still a practice that is in many armies throughout the world right now for that reason. So it's making me think of that context as well, of using singing to build cohesion when it's absolutely needed.
And we can see one of the most powerful examples, I think, of this kind of singing in order to build social cohesion came in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where there was newsreels of women coming together to make nets for camouflage. And what did they do when they were there? They spontaneously sang. As their men left to go to war, they sang. It is something which doesn't always need to be organized. And I think though it clearly is, there's really excellent studies on the use of song to build nationalisms in Eastern Europe, for instance, deliberate use of song and collective singing to do that. However, I think that using again the example of walking and the clamour to be involved in the local walking that existed shows that it's not necessarily a conscious choice, a conscious decision that you are going to sing to feel better. It's just that you know that if you do sing, you will feel better, and you do it as part of the ritual of life. Yeah, it's fascinating, I think.
Bechugging Corm chuisce Daniela Gusonrich Line. But I just had one thought to follow that around your timeline and how long you think it takes to get from the point where people can't sing because it's too painful or they're just not there to the point where these strategies are beginning to feel like a productive way to try and move forward. And is that because we think a lot about trauma spanning generations and responses spanning generations. How far is your sense of how far are they having to get before there's enough distance that they can begin to pick up the threads again?
I think there's maybe a couple of ways to think about it. I think that there's lots of timelines going on at the same time. You know, it's a varied picture, and there's certain things happening in certain places that don't happen in others. So I think it's hard to answer completely due to the variability of the experience of trauma across Gaelic Scotland. Putting that to one side, the scientific research really shows us that it's very, very quick. The project that I quoted, looking at the reduction of immunoglobulin A and of cortisol, an increase of immunoglobulin A, that was noted upon one session of singing together, only one, and that this physiological change increased every time that the group came together. So it shows that it doesn't actually take too much time for there to be at least some change. I think if we look at my suggestion in this paper is that in order to be able to build the next part of the process, which is to create a social movement and a social and a shared sense of identity, I think we can see that doesn't really begin to emerge in Gaelic Scotland until the 1860s. So we're looking at least 10 years, 10 to 15 years, even more perhaps, until really all of the threads begin to be able to, all of the different groups are able to begin to work together. So I know it's a complicated answer in some ways. It's immediate, and it's having to happen at different times in different places with different groups. But I think overall we're looking at a 10-year process for people to be able to start coming together.
Míle thank. Ceistig Meg agus nu sin Dolly Marie. Meg,
hello, and thank you for that talk. I was just thinking what you said about Jacobites being re-traumatized by singing Jacobite songs. And I thought about Burns's Ye Jacobites by Name, which despite the title is I won't say anti-Jacobite, but anti-war. And also in Dougal Buchanan, I can't remember which of his hymns it is, maybe on Bhuaidh. And I think it's there he says that the Jacobite and Hanoverian division is like ants fighting over a stick of wood, and people would be better to turn to God. That's all I thought of, I'm afraid.
No, it's really useful. It's a fascinating area. My suspicion, the reason for my thinking this is based on a study that was done in South Africa, where they noted that children were really very, very scared of white men coming through the village in the 2010s. And they didn't understand why until they realised that these children had were reliving trauma from the 1950s of an attack that happened, and they were doing it through passing on a playground song which warned them from generation to generation against engaging with white men in cars that had been created in response to this attack in the 1950s. And it made me think about the impact of singing these Jacobite songs, because of course the Oavas, the horrendous, the horror that happens after the 45 is not that long ago. And why on earth would Gaels want to risk themselves by really protesting if things could only get worse, and there's not much light. So this is my thinking. So I'm going to have a look at that song for sure, see if I can draw some more thoughts together on it. Yeah, interesting.
Can you tell me again, you cited someone who'd come up with the phrase musicking. Can you say who?
Christopher Small. He is excellent. He's amazing.
So very
Everyone should
interesting.
read him. Should read Christopher Small and also Thomas Torino. I'll put in their links into the chat here.
Thank you.
Yes, more than tang.
Jenny.
I just very briefly to say thanks again, and it's interesting having a look at, immediately after the famine, one thing which was pulling people together, especially in diaspora communities, was Donegal McIntyre and the cairn, which was built for Donegal, which was, this is a subscription thing above Loch. Everybody drives past it without a second glance nowadays, but it's a big thing when it was erected. And I think they were trying to use Donegal as being a sort of a figure that everybody could unite behind a great bard. There's all sorts of Freemasonic side to it as well, the way the monument is built, and also all the people who are subscribing for it as well. But that's another thing to look at. But it's very, very interesting what's happening during the 1850s, immediately after the famine and the bad emigrations taking place in the early 1850s, trying to pull people together. And if you look at the newspapers, this is one thing that people were pushing at the time, a way of reclaiming Gaelic.
Donoghal's band famously was not a Jacobite.
Yeah, absolutely, he was not a Jacobite. He certainly wasn't. He was a good member of the Fencible, Bred Albion Fencible Regiment, so he was properly loyal. But yeah, they chose him as being a figure that people could, like you say, unite around. I guess the other thing is looking at the notion of nations being coming together through print. They're also being they're sung into existence, and just the importance of songs, like you were saying, in private schools, public schools, and indeed in universities as well. Once they left private school, they all went to university and they sang university songs. John Stuart Blackie was very keen on university songs as well as in Gaelic. So across Europe, I think the notion of songs as something which gives institutions an identity, whether they're private schools or whether they're Gaels, not connected with clan, not connected with island or glen. That's being created through song. But that's enough. That's something for much longer talks over drams sometimes.
Hopefully soon.
Jenny.
Hello.
Hello.
Matt, oes gen i rhys. Fashion, ho un sy'n chwrs
Jenny, fu I'm Karen Brecht. Danish in Beacha fiaching a soonish video gnis nach be barok bandwidth target to notion.
Okay, we can change it. Yeah, when we did a course on it, I miss mentioned Christopher Johnny with a put you Gamagama flash get a sort of dream PhD Akamsa, so I shall plan now.
Oh, thank God.
And this menu more than rounds here, no menu more than me and Karen co-theacs and Bhiodh, that's been in intergenerational trauma. I guess Maraha. h-òrain a chuideachadh in Bhiodh had Gàidhealach housemaker language loss, chuideachadh dèidh ik Gàidhealach san ceòl had a ginsach Gàidhealach as-ùrachadh no an siach in chickis chuideach agus mar sin an sculptin gus dynne a haring cóla agus rí chuideachadh le caran suíocha chanan chuideach go láidú.
Ha mi smé gur hier jo topic round sa hi aviation. So de chod fit a hiano. Ha mi smé va go ide. So ha eentje rutten en nog aan het blianne raas sé an toran na fuatigen leskippen is. Dus je van mis me guro sé doe zo geentjenoch skaas guro Oef al geen kolch wish na hor an je van nog gek san neie blin gie ge ba fiach in wie rut aharachig. Agus beshin an leich mi ein Marine Protection Act va change go batter sai. Agus go tuk mis me hu ha ingenieur go mara ha call an coltok riskitin jo trail west jo ha grúnach go ann is in go hannain. Geharid ans na Bhiodh Mòire. Persona ha na call an seo geharid na coltok riskitin is a leigheas. A bain luch éiste chomór an an náitcin mar Glasgow nio dnéidjan is amis me hu gur fi gré dói a haun son dönje an kuch fi anje a healthing agus vi mar a feraching mar govirat mar fars je cultúr na Gaeilge agus na Gàidhealach an an dói a ha gema accessible gaif. So yeah, appergeest gaan je la beachten beke akem nein draasde ach yeah drama yoga ediest sin agus bi thora varach beachten akem it's between
Kesh na pungig dyn sy'n biela.
Dwi'n film.
Thierry.
All the time.
Maar de hel, feitjin a kain gehus gar Rona Wilkie, dus zo'n oras ho eentje nog exnution jespe, ho eentje nog tigwan. A mi doch is gen kleintje baroch get it in, agus gen bis in de kola, agus shine kola, ja, hadi brin, agus drama gawa. Ach, moren tangerist, agus.
Mille tang.
Ja, dat beleid, hele leven zijn.
Mille tanger son nach orm. Tang wo. Thierry ma.
Oh, go eentje nog. Adule vallen men ven ach maar ha fesak bi klarig in teschen show also is het YouTube unu again en is geveld kormer vi skipper maar joch begin op het Jessica in en so vi show aan I guess vi kormer naam could you Cora Human, Rona, we wist to a show from powder, you know, where's the Alex Ashen dogs can fiction in and and then you need not be wrote at the
be a special meer son. Oh, wat me gaat branden op in go.
Oh no. Not gonna try each be Cora me la.
Be can check.
Ja, I'm getting. Oh,
well, back in the sheet, ma. Thierry, I just thank all of you.
Thierry, mille thank.
Thierry.